Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. On behalf of the Jesuits of Canada, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar. What does the Catholic Church have to say about the conflict in Israel-Palestine? Presented by Father David Newhouse. Before we begin, there are a couple of housekeeping details. The presentation will be 90 minutes. This will include the presentation and time for questions and answers. Please enter your questions in the Q&A box. They may be missed if you put them in the chat box. I will not be checking my email or text during the presentation, so please do not send questions directly to me. A link to the recording of the presentation will be sent to registered participants within 72 hours. Change to the French channel if you would like the French translation. We begin, as usual, by acknowledging the indigenous peoples of the lands we are on today. While we meet on a virtual platform, let us take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which many of us call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local indigenous peoples and their cultures. In Canada, from coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and commit, each in our own way, to move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Father David Newhouse. David is a member of the Society of Jesus. He teaches scripture in various institutions in Israel and Palestine. He completed a BA, MA, and PhD in political science at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He completed pontifical degrees in theology and scripture in Paris and Rome. He is Emeritus Latin Patriarchal Vicar for Hebrew-speaking Catholics in Israel and coordinator of the pastoral among migrants and asylum seekers in Israel. Most important is that David lives with the people of the Holy Land. He journeys with them and knows too well the suffering they experience in their daily lives. On a personal note, I first met David many years ago in Jerusalem when he taught at the Papal Institute, where I was studying with Dr. Marina Fritz. I remember particularly a lecture he gave on the infancy narratives. 2 hours went by, and he had only covered a few passages of Luke. He brought each word of the text to life, and I was on the edge of my seat for the whole lecture. It seemed like only 10 minutes had gone by, and I was grateful to be there. David, we have participants logged on from around the world: South Africa, Zambia, Ireland, England, Philippines, Israel, Palestine, the United States, Belgium, and of course, Canada, and numerous other countries. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Patricia, for having me yet again. I'm very happy that you mentioned that we first met in a context in which I was speaking about scripture. You know, of course, that I love speaking about scripture much more than I love speaking about politics. So maybe one day I might even be invited to do something on scripture. So good evening to everyone. As you know, this lecture arose out of a lecture that I did about a month ago on the ongoing war in Gaza And of course, we continue to pray for justice and peace in Israel-Palestine. During that lecture, the interest arose for a bit of background about what does the church say about Israel and Palestine. And I'd like to discuss that tonight, giving a little bit of history and then looking at the actual themes which the church engages in order to understand and promote. Once again, I'm going to share with you a PowerPoint and do the lecture on the basis of this PowerPoint so that you can follow more closely. So I'm confident that you now see the PowerPoint on your screen. And as you see again, what does the Catholic Church have to say about the conflict in Israel-Palestine? Just a word about the illustrations. This comes from the visit of Pope Francis to the Holy Land in 2014. Two of the most prominent images were the traditional visit to the Western Wall. Of course, every visit to the Holy Land means further engagement with the Jewish people, with whom we have an ongoing relationship of reconciliation and profound conversation. But there was another wall that very much featured in the Pope's visit, and that is the wall that surrounds the little pieces of Palestine that are somehow governed by the Palestinian autonomy. Again, so much hope in the middle of the 1990s that finally there would be two states for two people in that land, and sadly, that has not been realized. And very dramatic was the Pope's visit to Bethlehem. And on his way from the helicopter port where he arrived from Jordan, on his way to visit with the Palestinian president in the presidential palace in Bethlehem, he stopped by the wall that separates between Israel and Bethlehem and other parts of the Palestinian territories, and laid his head in prayer. A few weeks after he left, he invited the Israeli president and the Palestinian president, Shimon Peres and Mahmoud Abbas, to a prayer service in the Vatican Gardens. And that was a very, very moving ceremony 10 years ago in June 2014. Let us now plunge into our discussion tonight of what does the Catholic Church have to say about the conflict in Israel-Palestine. So first of all, we need to realize that there are three very distinct periods when we talk about the engagement of the Church in the modern history of the Holy Land. First of all, the engagement with the reality of the British Mandate from 1917 to 1948. I think that we will all remember that in 1917, in November, the British published a letter from the British Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Foreign Secretary, Lord Arthur Balfour, to Lord Rothschild, one of the leading Jewish figures in England. And that letter, that declaration, said that the British would work for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Jews at that time were just over 10% of the population. The British conquered Palestine from the Turks 6 weeks later, and this commitment to Jewish national desires in Palestine was set into the British mandate as part of the mandate, a mandate that lasted for just over 30 years. Then we have the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, and it took the Holy See a long time to recognize fully the political entity that we know as the State of Israel. And that recognition was given at a time that there was real hope that two states would emerge from the morass of war and ongoing tension from 1948 until the Oslo agreements in the mid-1990s. And that's why we have from 1948 to 1993, before the recognition of the State of Israel, of course, ongoing contact with this reality, but full recognition in an atmosphere of hope, when really there was a hope that two states would come to be in the Holy Land. And then from 1993, with the recognition of Israel at the end of 1993, full diplomatic relations between the Holy See and the State of Israel. December 1993, the agreement signed. And then with the State of Palestine in 2000, an agreement signed with the Palestine Liberation Organization. The Holy See would later recognize the State of Palestine in 2013. So just very brief sketches of what went on at this time before we delve into the real position of the Holy See on the conflict in Palestine, the major themes that preoccupy the Church. As early as 1922, the Secretary of State for the Holy See, Cardinal Gaspari, wrote to the Secretary General of the League of Nations, of course, that international body that preceded the United Nations, that in fact delivered the mandate for Palestine to the British. So the Secretary of State, Cardinal Gaspari, writes to the Secretary General of the League of Nations that although the Holy See has no objection to the British receiving the mandate for Palestine, it does have great reservations about the implied change in the status of the Jewish residents. And of course, this refers directly to the Balfour Declaration's insertion into the mandate for Palestine, meaning, of course, that the British announced their intention to help Jews establish in Palestine a Jewish homeland. Gaspari, while stressing that the Holy See does not oppose that the Jews have equal civil rights in Palestine, stressed that it could not accept that the Jews be granted a privileged position. And of course, this very, very early on shows that the Holy See was aware that the British plan to set up a Jewish homeland in a country in which, when that declaration was made, the Jews constituted only 10%, would be very problematic for the other people living in the land, the Christians and Muslims. And remember, many of the Jews, all the Christians and Muslims at the time, or at least the vast majority of Christians and all the Muslims, were Palestinians. We jump forward to 1948. The end of the mandate comes in May. The British withdraw. The next day, the State of Israel is declared, and a civil war that had already begun in November 1947, when the United Nations decided to partition the Holy Land into a Jewish state and an Arab state, leading to the breaking out of a civil war between Jews and Arabs, Jews who were not yet Israelis, and Palestinian Arabs, becomes a regional war when the State of Israel is declared and the Arab armies mass in order to try and extinguish this Jewish entity. And of course, the Jewish armies that become now the Israeli armies, or the Jewish militias that form into the Israeli army, are successful, being supported by the great powers, both the Soviet Union and the United States, push back the Arab armies at an enormous price, and war becomes the reality of this land. Let's read from a statement of Pius XII, a declaration of Pius XII in 1948. I read it over and over and thought, wow, this could have been written even now to a large extent. The Pope writes then, among the multiple preoccupations which beset us in this period of time, so full of decisive consequences for the life of the great human family, and which make us feel so seriously the burden of the supreme pontificate, Palestine occupies a particular place on account of the war which harasses it. In all truth, we can tell you, venerable brethren, that neither joyous nor sad events diminish the sorrow which is kept alive in our soul by the thought that in the land in which our Lord Jesus Christ shed his blood to bring redemption and salvation to all mankind, the blood of man continues to flow, and that beneath the skies which echoed on that fateful night with the gospel tidings of peace. Men continue to fight and to increase the distress of the unfortunate and the fear of the terrorized, while thousands of refugees, homeless and driven, wander from their fatherland in search of shelter and food. Again, we can hear the pathos of Pope Pius XII's appeal for peace, for justice in the Holy Land already in 1948. We jump forward a number of years, and here we have Pope Paul VI's Christmas message in 1975, and it was the first time that a pontiff mentions the people of Palestine by name, the Palestinian people. And again, we see here an engagement with these two realities, the realities of the Jewish people, the historical reality of the Jews and their search for security in the state of Israel, a concern of the Holy See, and at the same time, the search for the recognition of the rights of the Palestinians, justice for a people that has been made a refugee people consigned to the margins of history. And so in 1975, Pope Paul VI, he had visited the Holy Land 11 years before, said this: although we are conscious of the still very recent tragedies which led the Jewish people to search for safe protection in a state of its own, sovereign and independent, and in fact, precisely because we are aware of this, we would like to ask the sons of this people to recognize the rights and legitimate aspirations of another people which have also suffered for a long time, the Palestinian people. We see here already the roots, the seeds of what Pope Francis will, in these very days, be trying to communicate, to be equi-close, an equi-vicinanza, an equi-closeness to both Jewish Israelis and Palestinian Arabs, but of course the constant appeal that they recognize one another. Very significant in the formulation of the attitude of the Holy See to the conflict in Israel-Palestine were the successive visits. Again, historical moments, not only for the Church of the Holy Land, but for all of the parties to the conflict. We see there Pope Paul VI, 1964 January. The council is going on, and for the first time, a pontiff, or the first time in modern history, a pontiff voyages beyond the borders of Italy. And Pope Paul VI will take this voyage to the roots of Christianity, the roots of the church, coming to visit both Jordan and Israel. But the political realities were very much marginal to the concern of the Pope with the roots of the church, the traditions of the church, and the ecumenism of the time, coming to meet the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople, Athenagoras. That was the real dramatic encounter at that time. Then Pope John Paul II in the year 2000, coming in a completely different time. There are relations with the state of Israel. There is the preparation for the accords with the Palestinian people. And so this visit will very much focus on both the meetings with Jews and the meetings with Muslims, the meetings with the Jewish authorities in the State of Israel and the Palestinian authorities. And this will be a remarkable visit, a very frail and feeble Pope striding into the midst of this Holy Land, still nurturing a hope. This was before the Israeli moves on the Temple Mount, on the Haram al-Sharif, which led to the outbreak of the Second Intifada. Still a hope, but dying fast, of some kind of accord between Israel and Palestine. John Paul II there seen with the two chief rabbis, the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi rabbi. 9 years later, Pope Benedict XVI comes to the Holy Land, following in the footsteps of John Paul II, going both to Palestine and to Israel, meeting with Palestinian and Israeli leaders. He is also, of course, engaged with Jewish leaders and with Muslim leaders. But Benedict XVI, his visit will focus very, very much on the vocation of Christians in the Holy Land, the Church, its survival being essential for the Holy Land and its dream of justice and peace. And then in 2014, the most recent visit, 10 years ago, Pope Francis comes to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Pope Paul's visit. And he will place at the center of his visit, again, the meeting with the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople. Here we see him with Bartholomew just outside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But Francis will also courageously engage with Palestinian reality and Israeli reality. He will be pulled back and forth. He will meet with Jewish authorities and Muslim authorities. But interestingly, after the visit, he will invite the presidents of the two political authorities to come for a very emotional and moving prayer service in June in the Vatican Gardens. So, following through with these historic moments, the 1993 fundamental agreement between the Holy See and the State of Israel, a very important move whereby Israel, the State of Israel, engages with the Holy See on a political level. But of course, many will see beyond politics and seek for also a spiritual grounding of this agreement in the relationship between Jews and Catholics. The beginning of this document says, the Holy See and the State of Israel, mindful of the singular character and universal significance of the Holy Land, aware of the unique nature of the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Jewish people, and of the historic process of reconciliation and growth in mutual understanding and friendship between Catholics and Jews. Yes, it has been difficult to separate the political from the religious and spiritual, especially as, of course, Jewish people see themselves as a people very much linked to this land. And parallel, the establishment of full relations with the representatives of the Palestinian people in the Palestine Liberation Organization that will be followed years later with the recognition of the State of Palestine. Many say there is no State of Palestine, but there should be. And I think that many countries have a diplomatic accord with the State of Palestine, recognizing that international law, going back all the way to 1947, has insisted that there should be a State of Palestine, that this people has a legitimate right to self-determination. Again, from the basic agreement, we can read, a peaceful solution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which would realize the inalienable, national, legitimate rights and aspirations of the Palestinian people, to be reached through negotiation and agreement in order to ensure peace and security for all peoples of the region on the basis of international law, relevant United Nations and its Security Council resolutions, justice, and equity. Some words of Pope Benedict, and again, his brilliant 27 speeches in just a few days. This is from his address at Ben Gurion Airport the day that he left. No friend of the Israelis and the Palestinians can fail to be saddened by the continuing tension between your two peoples. No friend can fail to weep at the suffering and loss of life that both peoples have endured over the last 6 decades. Allow me to make this appeal to all the peoples of this land, of these lands. No more bloodshed, no more fighting, no more terrorism, no more war. Instead, let us break the vicious circle of violence. Let there be lasting peace based on justice. Let there be genuine reconciliation and healing. And then, a few years later, Pope Francis, the most recent papal visit, also speaking at Ben Gurion Airport. He says, I renew the appeal made in this place by Pope Benedict XVI. The right of the State of Israel to exist and to flourish in peace and security within internationally recognized borders must be universally recognized. At the same time, there must also be a recognition of the right of the Palestinian people to a sovereign homeland and their right to live with dignity and with freedom of movement. The two-state solution must become reality and not remain merely a dream. Now, this remains the position of the Catholic Church, but I do want to add one declaration that opens up perhaps a horizon that is not yet the Church's position, but which is coming from the local church in Israel-Palestine, the church that represents the Christians of the land. And so, all the while that we do recognize that the two-state solution is the solution proposed by the international community, and the church fully supports that solution, as it's stated all the time in recent times, I do want to add that the bishops of the Holy Land brought out a statement in 2019 that perhaps opened a horizon that is now being discussed in many circles. And again, this is not the Holy See, but the Church of the Holy Land. And they wrote, we promote a vision according to which everyone in this Holy Land has full equality, the equality befitting all men and women created equal in God's own image and likeness. We believe that equality, whatever political solutions might be adopted, is a fundamental condition for a just and lasting peace. Again, the focus on equality, the equality of two people, perhaps two states, or the equality of all men and women living in one unitary state, less important than the principle itself: we are created in the image and likeness of God. The bishops of the Holy Land continue, we have lived together in this land in the past. Why should we not live together in the future too? The together there, of course, two states living side by side in close collaboration, or one state where Jews, Muslims, and Christians, Israelis and Palestinians, are equal citizens in one state. This is our vision for Jerusalem and the whole land called Israel and Palestine between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. These are historical moments in the development of a position that I would like now to explicitate along 4 axes of concern. I would argue that when the Holy See formulates its position on the Holy Land, on Israel-Palestine, it is specifically concerned with these 4 axes. Axis number 1, the church in the Holy Land, meaning not only, of course, the institution, but the Christians who live in the Holy Land, the ones who are the brothers and sisters of all Christians all over the world. And not only the church and the Christians, but also a deep concern for the holy places, a concern that we certainly heard echoed in the words that I read from the declaration of Pope Pius XII, but this is a repeated concern of the Church and the Holy See always. 2, biblical texts that talk about the land definitely need to be interpreted. The land and the Bible is a very complicated theme, but because the Church certainly derives its doctrine from the Bible, and the heart of theology is the Bible, there is no getting away from the complexity of reading of biblical texts so that we can come up with a thinking that is consonant with sacred scripture. The 3rd axis is the axis of interreligious dialogue. Again, a very important aspect of the Church's life and teaching, at least since the Second Vatican Council. The Church is in deep relationship with Jews and with Muslims, in conversation and dialogue, and perhaps even more importantly, in collaboration to build a better world. One of the remarkable scenes in 2014 during the visit of Pope Francis was that he was accompanied by 2 Argentinian friends, 2 friends from his time as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, one of them a rabbi and one of them a Muslim imam. And here we see them embracing, the 3 of them, before the Western Wall. And finally, the Church is profoundly committed to the search for justice and peace. Let's look a little bit more in detail at these 4 axes. The Church in the Holy Land, Israel-Palestine, first of all, the Holy See is very conscious that we are not talking about just another local church. We are talking about the mother church, where it all began, the land which Christ walked, which the disciples walked, the land from which the preaching of the gospel began. Of course, yes, all of this rooted in the New Testament. So a particular awareness of the importance of this land in the life of the church. Then, of course, the realization that Christians and churches have custody of the holy places, those places of memory, where through all the ages pilgrims have come to refuel, to rekindle their faith. Very, very important, not more important than the Christians themselves, but a very important treasure of the church. The church is aware that there is a diversity of denominations among Christians. We pray for peace, but we also appreciate the beauty in that diversity, as so many Christian denominations are present in Jerusalem, officially 13 heads of churches in Jerusalem. But also a diversity of ethnicities. And interestingly, the church in the Holy Land, in Israel-Palestine today, is a real microcosmos of all the peoples that live there. The most rooted of the Christians are the Palestinian Arab, Christian Palestinian Arabs of all that diversity of denominations. But at least in the last period, since 1948, there has been a small and vibrant Hebrew-speaking church. Again, people coming with Jewish migrants, some of them Christians, some of Jewish origin. I myself am of Jewish origin. As an Israeli citizen, I'm a member of a Hebrew-speaking church, although active also in the Arabic-speaking church. And then, of course, like all of our lands today, a vast diversity of migrants and asylum seekers. Interesting to point out, of course, that the Roman Catholic diocese of Jerusalem, what we call the Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem, is a diocese made up of a number of states, for it includes Cyprus, yes, historically part of the Holy Land, Israel, Palestine, and Jordan, all in one diocese. Again, the challenge of actually administering a church of such diversity of nationalities and political situations is astounding. And of course, the diversity of ideologies within the church, and added to all of that complexity, a recognition of the constant stream of pilgrims who come to Jerusalem and feel at home there. At least they feel that they are visiting their mother church. I felt it important to add this photograph to the discussion of the church in the Holy Land. This was one of the most moving pictures that came out of the little Roman Catholic parish in the middle of Gaza City. There we see the deputy parish priest in the middle, Father Yusuf, an Egyptian, surrounded by a group of children who celebrated their first communion in the midst of the war, in the midst of that church becoming the only refuge for these people living in Gaza. So I add that as an image of this church in the Holy Land. Pope Francis has made it his duty to call with great regularity this parish and find out how they are doing. This parish has undergone great travail, with a number of parishioners being killed or dying because of lack of medical treatment, and its sister Greek Orthodox parish having also been bombarded, leading to the death of 18 people in the church compound. The second axis, very complicated, and we can only go through it very, very fast, but the land and the Bible. Yes, the Bible is our sacred scripture, and this particular land predominates everywhere in the biblical text, in the Old and in the New. Remember that from the time of the call of Abraham in Genesis 12, the call to go to this land, the land that God shows Abraham, until the time of Jesus and beyond, this land is absolutely central to the scriptures. Of course, in the Old Testament, this land is a bordered land, a land that contains a particular people of God, the people of Israel. But from a Christian point of view, that people is the people that will give us the Messiah. Out of this people comes Jesus. And in a certain sense, Jesus brings an incredible change to the concept of land. For with Jesus emerging from the tomb, the borders between lands come tumbling down. He was crucified, and on the cross, he destroyed the wall of division. I would add the borders that divide peoples from people, giving rise to the dream that we are all one human family, all sons and daughters of God, and the church, the land of the church, will spread wherever the gospel is proclaimed. Of course, this is a Christian reading of the biblical texts. The challenge of reading the text is, of course, to be Christian in reading it and to enter into a profound dialogue with our Jewish brothers and sisters who read the same scriptures that we have in the Old Testament and understand them very differently. We need to listen. We'll say more about that in a moment. One of the issues that the church confronts are Zionist readings. Again, what are Zionist readings? Well, Zionism is the national movement of the Jewish people, but Zionism can also take a Christian form. And the Christian form of Zionism sees that the land is still the place where Jews must live. Zionists would encourage Jews to come and live in the land. But not for very Jewish reasons. For evangelicals who are Christian Zionists would seem to think that somehow Jesus can only come. We are waiting for him to come. His second coming can only come when there is a restoration of Jews to the land. Zionist readings can be Jewish readings, but then we engage in conversation with Jews when they are evangelical readings. They attempt to read as Christians the sacralization of this land and the ideologization of this conflict, and we as Catholics are called to be wary of such readings. Liberation theology readings have followed, whereby God is seen as the great liberator. And there are Palestinian liberation theologians, contextual theologians, who are trying to free up the biblical text from any constrained nationalist reading that leads us further into violence, now a violence whereby God is on our side because it says so in the Bible. Liberation theologians, particularly in Palestine, would be very fast to point out the horrors that such readings have brought upon the people of Palestine. In 1993, the then Archbishop of Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Cyprus, the Latin Patriarch of the Holy Land, Michel Sabah, published a very important document entitled Reading the Bible Today in the Land of the Bible, trying to answer these difficult questions from the context of the conflict. And near the beginning of the document, he writes, could we be the victims, we Palestinians who are Christians and readers of the Bible, could we be the victims of our own salvation history, which seems to favor the Jewish people and condemn us? Is that truly the will of God to which we must inexorably bow down, demanding that we deprive ourselves in favor of another people with no possibility of appeal or discussion? These questions that are posed by readers of the Bible with regard to the Palestinian people are dealt with in this seminal document. And of course, all of us Christians reading the Bible in the land of the Bible are faced with this challenge of how to understand the Old Testament and the New within a conflict that has sometimes manipulated biblical texts to justify violence, colonialism, and dispossession. Of course, when it comes to how Jews read the Bible, we are called to enter into this wonderful dialogue. We have moved from contempt to respect with regard to the Jewish people. Our discourse has been transformed, I would hope, 180 degrees, from a teaching of contempt to a teaching of respect for the Jewish people. In the background, you see there these two images of synagogue and ecclesia. Ecclesia, the medieval version, standing upright, proud, looking out, and synagogue, bent over, blindfolded, the mace of her authority broken, the crown fallen from her head, and then the modern version after Vatican II, this wonderful statue that stands on the grounds of St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, synagogue and ecclesia, reading together the scriptures, both of them crowned, learning from one another. And this new relationship means that we can take action together to build a better world, working together for tikkun olam, the repair of a broken world. This too is an integral part of the Church's concern whenever she addresses the question of Israel-Palestine, aware of how much many Jews feel connected to the state of Israel and the land of Israel. And here we see the three popes, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis, standing before the Western Wall. And I put here a quotation from Nostra Aetate, that wonderful document in 1965, published in October at the end of the Council. And therein, in paragraph 4, it states very clearly, God holds the Jews most dear for the sake of their fathers. He does not repent of the gifts he makes or of the calls he issues. Such is the witness of the apostle. And we affirm this constantly in relationship to our Jewish brothers and sisters. But of course, when it comes to the political issues of our time, we might not see eye to eye. And so in 1985, in an important document on the correct way to present Jews and Judaism in preaching and catechesis in the Roman Catholic Church, the Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews said the following, and I think this wording is very important for us to look at carefully and understand. Christians are invited to understand the Jewish religious attachment which finds its roots in biblical tradition. Of course, the attachment is to the land of Israel. Yes, Jews look to that land as a land of their roots. So again, I'll read this first part. Christians are invited to understand the Jewish religious attachment to the land, which finds its roots in biblical tradition. But then comes what is decisive, I think, for the position of the church, without, however, making their own any particular religious interpretation of this relationship. The existence of the state of Israel and its political options should be envisaged not in a perspective which is in itself religious, but in their reference to the common principles of international law. Again, this often creates tension in the relationship with Jewish people. But at the same time, we as church are committed to justice and peace in Palestine, Israel, in Israel-Palestine, and we cannot use biblical texts or the relationship with the Jewish people to ignore our Palestinian brothers and sisters. But we are not only in relationship with Jews. We are in a profound dialogue with Muslims as well, a dialogue rooted in that same document, Nostra Aetate. Look at the images. We see Muslims walking around the Haram al-Sharif, the holy shrine of Islam in Jerusalem, the third most holy place in Islam, visited by Pope John Paul II, by Pope Benedict XVI, and by Pope Francis. And again, I'd like to read the words from Nostra Aetate that put us on a new road with Muslims as well. Since in the course of centuries, not a few quarrels and hostilities have arisen between Christians and Muslims, this sacred synod, this is the Second Vatican Council, this sacred synod urges all to forget the past and to work sincerely for mutual understanding and to preserve as well as to promote together for the benefit of all mankind social justice and moral welfare as well as peace and freedom. The relationship with Muslims has been very much underlined during the pontificate of Pope Francis, and in 2019 in Abu Dhabi, he met with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, the most prestigious academic institution, scholarly institution in the Islamic world in Cairo, Sheikh Ahmed al-Tayyib, and in a document on human fraternity for world peace and living together, it is written a message so important also for our time right now. Religions must never incite war, hateful attitudes, hostility and extremism, nor must they incite violence or the shedding of blood. These are principles that we as Catholics and Muslims can agree upon. These tragic realities are the consequence of a deviation from religious teachings. They result from a political manipulation of religions and from interpretations made by religious groups who in the course of history have taken advantage of the power of religious sentiment in the hearts of men and women in order to make them act in a way that has nothing to do with the truth of religion. This is done for the purpose of achieving objectives that are political, economic, worldly, and short-sighted. We thus call upon all concerned to stop using religions to incite hatred, violence, extremism, and blind fanaticism, and to refrain from using the name of God to justify acts of murder, exile, terrorism, and oppression. Powerful words that ring out loud and clear in a world that is so much immersed in wars that often seem to be using religion to legitimate parties in the war. And then the fourth axis, justice and peace. Yes, the church is absolutely committed to seeking out a way whereby there can be justice and peace in the land. First of all, the church is perfectly aware that there can be no peace without justice, and when the church speaks always about justice and peace. The church is also very much aware that justice means freedom, freedom for all, and equality of all. Again, the church sees freedom and equality as foundationally rooted in our sacred scripture and vehicled by church tradition. We have not always been promoters of freedom and equality. We recognize that with enormous regret. And we remember that an integral part of John Paul II's entry into this millennium was asking forgiveness. Indeed, asking forgiveness for all the times that we have not recognized the freedom of others and the equality of all. The church today is committed to two states. Two states. The church repeats with great regularity, as the church has done in the past few months, that the only way to bring about a solution in Israel-Palestine is to allow these two peoples, the Jewish Israeli people and the Palestinian Arab people, to have the right of self-determination. As that is not realized, and we remember that it was the basis of the partition in 1947, and yet in 2024, we still do not have two states. There are those, even within the church, who are beginning to talk about a one-state solution where all are equal citizens recognized in the fullness of their image and likeness. To end, some words that come from Pope Francis within the context of the present ongoing war. We cannot forget that this is the context for our discussion on the position of the church. And so I'd like to read from two important texts that really provoke a lot of thought. First of all, from Pope Francis's address to the diplomatic corps on the 8th of January this year. And this is what he writes, or this is what actually he said to the diplomats gathered before him in the Vatican. All of us remain shocked by the October 7th attack on the Israeli people, in which great numbers of innocent persons were horribly wounded, tortured and murdered, and many taken hostage. I renew my condemnation of this act and of every instance of terrorism and extremism. This is not the way to resolve disputes between peoples. Those disputes are only aggravated and cause suffering for everyone. Indeed, the attack provoked a strong Israeli military response in Gaza that has led to the death of tens of thousands of Palestinians, mainly civilians, including many young people and children, and has caused an exceptionally grave humanitarian crisis and inconceivable suffering. To all the parties involved, I renew my appeal for a ceasefire on including Lebanon, and the immediate liberation of all the hostages held in Gaza. I ask that the Palestinian people receive humanitarian aid and that hospitals, schools, and places of worship receive all necessary protection. It is my hope that the international community will pursue with determination the solution of two states, one Israeli and one Palestinian, as well as an international guaranteed special status for the city of Jerusalem, so that Israelis and Palestinians may finally live in peace and security. Again, the Pope basically repeating a position that has developed over decades. Again, the vicinanza, closeness to both Israelis and Palestinians, with their insistence on justice for both, equality for all. I end with a personal letter that the Pope sent to Jewish brothers and sisters in Israel on the 2nd of February. It is a very cleverly crafted, wisely crafted, spiritually profound letter that the Pope sent to Jews in Israel after receiving massive criticism for not supporting the state of Israel in its war. And these are the words that the Pope wrote. With them, I will end my presentation and we can open up for discussion. In times of desolation, we have great difficulty seeing a future horizon where light replaces darkness, in which friendship replaces hatred, in which cooperation replaces war. However, we, as Jews and Catholics, are witnesses to precisely such a horizon. I add here, who would have believed that Jews and Catholics could engage in the type of intimate conversation that we do since 1965? That can be a model for Israel-Palestine. And we must act, starting first and foremost from the Holy Land, where together we want to work for peace and justice, doing everything possible to create relationships capable of opening new horizons of light for everyone, Israelis and Palestinians. Again, I think Pope Francis is saying that in our dialogue, our Jewish Catholic dialogue, which some have tried to mobilize in support of war, if this is truly a relationship of transformation, we need to mobilize that relationship in order to work together for justice and peace that will enable a better future for Israelis and Palestinians in the land of Israel-Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you, David. You've given us quite a lot to think about. And we already have many questions coming in. So let's get into it. President Biden is fully, reliably reported to have declared re-Gaza that the Pope is on the same page as he is. Has the Pope clearly contradicted that statement?
Oof, you begin with a difficult question. So I am not a diplomat. I think that the Holy See is obligated to be diplomatic. And I would say that right from the beginning, with regard to this present round of incredible violence in Gaza, the differences have been very, very clear. I'd like to go back to the 8th of October, when the Pope said very, very clearly, war is defeat for everyone. Whereas President Biden, at the beginning of the present round, said that he is squarely and fully behind Israel and Israel's complete right, and for so long an uncriticized right, to respond to aggression. So I would say, no, there is quite an abyss between the two. But I would also add that it seems to me slowly, far too slowly, But surely the United States administration is coming to realize that that uncriticized support for the state of Israel has brought about too much death, too much disaster.
From a distance, there is a perception that the Christian churches of the Holy Land have offered, aside from brief statements, a muted response to what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank. What is limiting or compromising the local Christian churches beyond the reality of the history of anti-Semitism from speaking out, organizing protests, marching, etc.?
So I think that there is a very strong reaction, perhaps not always from the first the statements of the Commission for Justice and Peace, which is the Catholic version of like-minded commissions all over the world, has very complicated for a number of reasons. For they have done, and sometimes very courageously. One, the Christian population is a tiny, tiny population and absolutely dependent on the goodwill of the political authorities. That means, yes, in Israel, the Israeli administration. And church leadership has come in for incredibly violent condemnation from Israeli sources right from the beginning of the war. So the very first declaration that was made by the Christian churches was lambasted by the Israeli ambassador to the Vatican. Pope Francis has been severely criticized. And so Christian leaders really need to think very, very carefully what to say and when to say it. And sometimes they have not said what perhaps needed to be said, or have not done what needed to be done. But again, they are in an incredibly difficult situation. So yes, there is frustration, enormous frustration from among Christian Palestinians themselves. Why is the church not more outspoken? And I understand that and fully resonate with that frustration, while at the same time looking at the great complexities that I try to lay out tonight in terms of nurturing relationships in multi-directional forms that make speaking out sometimes very difficult. I do think that the church has the obligation to enunciate clearly a vision of the Holy Land that contrasts with the realities that we are living in now. I further add that Christian institutions have the obligation to incarnate those visions so that they can actually be real. And there I think that we are not doing such a bad job.
There are two similar questions. I'll read both of them. How difficult will it be for the Roman Catholic Church to move to a one-state solution? I believe that a two-state solution has been rendered impossible, and it seems especially now so in the wake of the war in Gaza. And you several times mentioned the beginning of some discussion among those within the church of the possibility of a single democratic state with equality for all. What path do you see forward, the church itself reevaluating its focus on a two-state solution, which, while may be favored by some, only cements into place the divisions between people and reinforcement of national identities over human commonalities?
So I would say that the church would not be the one to propose a single democratic state, a unitary democratic state where all people are equal. The church does not see itself as a political actor. It sees itself as a as a voice for morality, for correct teaching. The church, when it speaks out in favor of what the international community sees as the correct solution, the right solution, based again upon United Nations legislation, that does not confine certain people in the church from raising possibilities together with people outside of the church, that perhaps we need to start thinking beyond a formula, two states for two peoples, that does not always conjugate with the realities on the ground. And the realities on the ground, as we know, are extensive settlements all over what was perhaps at some point supposed to become the state of Palestine. Yeah, this makes reality very, very complicated. Again, I don't see the church taking the lead within the international community away from the two-state solution, but I do see around the world, and even in the United Nations, more and more voices that are challenging the two-state solution as it becomes more and more impossible to imagine what remains of territory that could become a Palestinian state.
Could you say more about the special status for the city of Jerusalem? Is that an integral part of the church's position? And do you think this is helpful to claim this?
So I would say that historically, it was most definitely an integral part of the church's position until the 1990s. In other words, in 1947, with the partition, the church was on board with the partition, but wanted Jerusalem out of the sovereignty of either the Jewish or the Arab state. The church very, very much was lobbying for a special status for Jerusalem, regarding Jerusalem as sacred for all peoples, and that Jerusalem should not be under any particular national sovereignty. And the status of Jerusalem would be international, regulated by the United Nations, ensuring completely free access for Jews, Christians, and Muslims to Jerusalem. I would say that that was repeated as absolutely integral to the position of the Holy See until the mid-1990s. Israelis started to speak together. The Holy See seemed to consider the possibility that if there would be an agreement between Israelis and Palestinians, an agreement that could guarantee justice and peace, tranquility, freedom of Jerusalem could somehow be shared by Israelis and Palestinians, and international status of Jerusalem could be foregone. But we have seen, in the light of what has gone on since the year 2000, and now reaching an absolute peak of hatred and rejection, that doesn't look like it's happening anytime soon. And so once again, the concern for the city of Jerusalem and its universal significance for Jews, Muslims, and Christians becomes again an issue. And so the church speaks up again in the language that it traditionally used for an international status for Jerusalem.
Re the Holy Land, usually interpreted in the Western world as belonging by right to Zionists. Were these lands not very violently conquered by invading Hebrews, the book of Joshua, etc., who killed and displaced the then inhabitants, claiming then and later that it was the promised land given to them by the divine mandate?
So I would say that many texts in the Bible are toxic if they are read without the proper analytic tools. And one of those texts might be the book of Joshua. Okay, it's very difficult to read in the book of Joshua, chapter 6, the conquest of Jericho, God saying, go in and slaughter everything that moves, everything that breathes. That is why we in the Catholic Church very strongly say, make sure that we are receiving as Catholics proper exegesis. I think the book of Joshua looks very, very differently if we ask the necessary historical critical questions. When was the book written? What purpose did it serve for the people for whom it was written? It was written hundreds and hundreds of years after any supposed period of the invasion of the tribes coming back from slavery. It takes a form that would make perfect sense in an Assyrian or Babylonian world where you marched in and wiped out the people who lived there. We know now from archaeology that many of the battles described never took place. The genocidal wars never took place. So again, I think it's very, very important to go back to a Christian reading of these texts. If you're Christian, okay, Jews struggle with these texts as well, but we're talking from the point of view of the Catholic Church, going back to these texts and reading them in the proper way, in the correct way, as they fit into the biblical canon. But again, texts ripped out of context and used in order to promote or legitimize a variety of interests. And of course, the Holy Land, Zionism, is not the only form of such use. We can rip verses out of the Bible in order to demote women. We can rip verses out of the Bible to promote slavery. I was born in South Africa. The regime was kind of founded on a Christian racism because of certain reading of texts that made white people superior to black people. And I put certain types of readings that promote dispossession, occupation, discrimination, inequality within the same ideologies of reading that that we've known all through the history of reading the Bible. The Bible is a toxic book. It can be a book full of poison. It's a book that I love and devote my life to because I feel that therein we can encounter God and find a language which is appropriate to speak about God. But we can. Often we don't. Often we dive into the Bible to grab verses that suit us. And there might be many verses that suit Christian Zionists who want to justify the dispossession of Palestinians and the empowerment of Zionists in the land. But I would say that we would find even more verses that would do the exact opposite and would say justice, peace, equality, and freedom are the basic values that we want to promote.
What is the Church's position on the right of return of Palestinian refugees? This is a right guaranteed in the UN Charter.
So again, we're talking about categories of international law. And the Church says that we want the discussion about Israel-Palestine not to be a religious discussion or a theological discussion. Of course, we can have that discussion with Jewish people in interpreting the texts, at looking at their own religious link to the land. But when it comes to the workings of states, the state of Israel, the state of Palestine, the Israeli people, the Palestinian people, it must be the categories of international law that apply. And so, what does the right of return mean? And somebody is saying it's rooted in the United Nations declaration. I'd say that there are many, many rights that are rooted in these declarations. The first and most important, going back to the League of Nations, was the right of self-determination. a right of self-determination that the Palestinians have never enjoyed in the modern period, and they have every right to enjoy that right to self-determination. It's within that context that we will have to look at what does it mean to execute a right of return for the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people today are around 14 million people in the world. 7 million of them live in historic Palestine. There is an equivalent in the state of Israel, right of return for the Jewish people, and I'm not in any way intending to make them parallels or compare them, but there are 16 million people, 16 million Jews in the world today, and 7 million of them live in Israel-Palestine. So I think once again, the discussion about rights of return need to come back to categories of international law in states that respect international law and can engage with one another in peaceful, serene discussion of the implications of these rights.
In Canada, the Rabbinical Council has ended its dialogue with the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. How and where is dialogue possible when Jewish religious organizations feel under pressure to refuse to call for peace?
So, of course, this is a very sad situation, and it's not only in Canada. We've had very harsh statements coming from rabbis all over the world. The chief rabbi of England, the chief rabbi of Rome, the chief rabbi of South Africa, and many, many other rabbis have come out with very, very strong statements, and there have been threats to cut off the dialogue with the Catholic Church. We are at a crisis point, and I think that Pope Francis sought to address that crisis in his letter of the 2nd of February. But I think that it is very, very important for us as Catholics to deeply value the relationship with our Jewish brothers and sisters without being bullied in taking positions that compromise our Palestinian brothers and sisters. This is the cross of our time, to enormously desire to continue the road of reconciliation, conversation, and mutual enrichment that has begun in the last decades with our Jewish brothers and sisters, to stand alongside them in the fight against anti-Semitism, which they feel is now rising up everywhere around them, to listen to them deeply and empathize with their fear and their pain. But never can that be at the expense of not standing in solidarity with our Palestinian brothers and sisters who have been dispossessed, exiled from their homeland, marginalized, and now have a very real sensation that they are being pushed over the edge into oblivion by the ongoing war in Gaza, the military actions in the West Bank, the crackdowns in Jerusalem, the horrific persecutions that are going on within the state of Israel of Palestinians who might raise their voice. And of course, this is a balancing act. It's not sitting on the fence. It's not saying nothing about anything because we're scared of reactions from either side, but speaking out a word of truth so that that truth can perhaps break through all of the lies and the propaganda and the ideologies that blinker people from seeing the full tragedy of what Israel-Palestine is going through today.
Please share any additional thoughts on the complicated effects of colonialism and its impact on the present-day complex challenges in the Holy Land. What might be helpful from our perspective in considering the occupation of the Holy Land even before 1948?
So again, a very, very pertinent question and a difficult one. And why is it difficult? Because I would say from the one side, Zionism formed itself within an environment where colonialism was the rule of the day. White Europeans went out from Europe and took over lands that were not theirs, ruled them, milked them, set up colonies there, and Zionism comes to its own way of thinking within a world that saw that as okay. Yeah, we are the civilized ones. We're bringing civilization. The good natives will appreciate our coming because we are bringing the civilization that they need. And certainly we can find texts in Zionist writings that absolutely correspond to that type of thinking. But, and this is where it becomes complicated, Zionism is not only that. Zionism does come out of a long Jewish religious, spiritual tradition of looking towards that land as a homeland. Now, I would say, and there were even some Zionists who would agree with this, I would say that that desire, that longing for the land, does not give any right to dominate the land. It gives a right to be there. It gives a right to come, perhaps even put down roots in that land, but never at the expense of Palestinian Arabs for whom that land is also a homeland. Primarily, it is their homeland. The Jews coming from elsewhere, wherever they came from. I'm not, of course, talking about the indigenous Jewish Palestinian population that has been there always, but the Jews that flooded into Palestine, particularly after 1917, and who sought to ignore the indigenous Arabic-speaking population made up of Jews, Christians, and Muslims, who brought in a completely foreign culture and intended to take over the land at the expense of the indigenous people. I would say that kind of Zionism is certainly a form of colonialism. But, again, another complication, most colonial settlers have a homeland to go back to. Many of the Jews who came to the Holy Land, beginning in the 1880s, the beginning of the 1880s, they didn't really have a homeland to go back to. They had been thrown out of the homelands that they had lived in for centuries. And so, yes, colonialism is helpful in seeing how Zionism can be colonialism. But I would say that there are ways of dreaming of Zion that are not necessarily colonialist. And those ways need to deeply engage with the Arabic, Muslim, also to some extent Oriental Christian nature of the Holy Land when it comes to the modern period. A Zionism that refuses to enter into that dialogue is a Zionism that is certainly problematic and might be a form of colonialism.
How can you respond to those that argue that the state of Israel should not stop the war until they have fully eliminated Hamas?
Okay, I mean, this is something that is being said repeatedly since the 7th of October. And of course, the big question to ask anyone who supports such a position is, can you please define for me with great accuracy, what do you mean by Hamas? Okay, it's as if I would come to America and say, I can't live in America, the United States of America. I know too little about Canada to make a sensible parallel, but I say, I need to wipe out all Republicans. I mean, what exactly does that mean? Okay, what does it mean to wipe out Hamas? If you give a list of names of these people who Israel regards as war criminals, then I can understand. They are looking at these particular people and judging them. Okay, again, I would say judicial process is absolutely essential here in this process of wiping out, because what does that mean? You go and wipe out. Where are we, in the Wild West? Here we are to some degree. Okay, so again, it goes back to, what do you mean by Hamas? When you have Israelis say all of the people living in Gaza are Hamas, well, that means genocide. You wipe out everybody in Gaza. Or does it mean a particular military echelon or a particular political leadership? I don't understand what the phrase means. It seems to be a slogan just to promote war, destruction, and more death.
Can the Vatican become a negotiator with Qatar and others towards a ceasefire and eventual peace and justice for Jews and Palestinians?
So I do not think that the Vatican wants to be a negotiator. I think that certain spokespeople that represent the church in some way or another can certainly be people feeding into a discourse that is sensible, sane, serene, respectful. I think that some people in the hierarchy of the church can serve as mediators when there is no communication between the two sides, and really there isn't much communication between the two sides. I think both sides might see the Vatican as a disinterested middle negotiator. Because let's remember that whether it's the Qataris or the United States or Russia or China or Egypt or Jordan or whichever country we're talking about, Turkey, each of them have interests and they put a certain slant on what's going on. It might be that the church can serve an important role because the church, I believe, is only interested in justice and peace, equality and liberty for all. The church is not a major political actor. The church does have everything to lose if war continues, meaning our Christian population will be totally decimated. The church has everything to gain if out of this morass, out of this catastrophe, comes an Israel-Palestine where people can live in security and peace, justice, equality, and freedom.
We only have time for one more question. Are the Christian communities in the Holy Land concerned that the government of Israel will come after them and expel them from the land? First, they came for the Palestinians.
So let me make it very, very clear. There is no such thing as the Christians of the Holy Land. A Christian is always a member of a people, okay? So to say Christians, they're going to go after the Palestinians and they come for the Christians. No, if they go after the Palestinians, that will include the Christians who are Palestinians, as is happening right now. Let us remember, and we need to say this over and over again, in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, there is a Christian community that are part and parcel of the society in Gaza Strip. Their institutions serve the people of Gaza, for they are Gazans, they are Palestinian Arabs who live in Gaza, and the same goes for the West Bank and for inside the state of Israel. The Christians are very concerned, if we can say that there is such a thing as a Christian concern. They are concerned that as a small group, whether they are Palestinian Arabs or whether they are Israelis, and I might even say Jewish Israelis, because this small group of Hebrew-speaking Christians within the state of Israel are almost camouflaged completely within the Jewish secular population, although they're Christian. We all together are concerned that the life of people who are minoritarian is very difficult in ongoing war. And we fear that Christians will choose to leave the country to ensure a better future for their children somewhere else. And that would be an unspeakable tragedy, to have the land of Jesus, to have the land of the church as a land without Christians. Again, the Christians are part and parcel of the two societies in which they live. And the church encourages Christians to be a leaven within these two societies, a leaven that is the leaven of justice, peace, equality, and freedom.
David, thank you very much. Thank you for your time, scholarship, and very interesting and challenging presentation. You've given us a solid foundation of the Catholic Church and its relationship to Israel-Palestine. And we join you in the prayer that the siege will end. I'd also like to thank David and our translators, Michelle and Albert, for their work today with us. And I encourage all of you to sign up for our next presentation on March 18th, where Dr. Murray Watson will talk about the Jewish gospel and gospel's Jewish voice. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you in the future. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much, Patricia. And thank you, Dave, and all the others.